In this video, I'm going to discuss the natural relationship between Mars and Saturn and how they mutually affect each other. And then we're going to look at what it means when they influence each other. And then we're going to look at Mars-Saturn conjunctions, and we're going to describe everything that is involved with that. All right, once again, I'm just going to lean back here and I'm going to thank you for taking time out of your busy day watching my video, because I'm sitting here sitting down. I don't know what you're doing. You might be on your drive home. You might be on the job. I don't know. You're watching this. I appreciate it. If you like it, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like it, this is about where you should go watch your videos of people getting kicked in the balls or whatever you like. Anyhow, with that being said, this video, Mars, Saturn, let's talk about it. Well, the interesting thing about Mars and Saturn is when you look at where Saturn and Mars are exalted and debilitated, you get it's really fascinating because there's a certain relationship between these two planets just in this aspect. And what I mean by that is Mars is exalted in Capricorn, which is a Rashi ruled by Saturn. So Saturn rules the place where Mars is at its highest energy. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, Aries is where Saturn is debilitated, where Saturn is at its lowest, which is in the Rashi of Mars. And what's even more interesting is that Aries is the Rashi where Mars is, Mula Trikona is where Mars sources its energy from Aries. That whole idea of Mars, where Mars sources its energy, is where Saturn operates in its lowest capacity. And so we have a certain opposite energy between the two, where Mars is comfortable and operates his best in the house where Saturn's comfortable at also. And then you have Saturn at its lowest, at its being put in its worst possible use inside of the place where Mars draws its energy from. So there's that fascinating part of their relationship. And so then if you just look in a natural relationship of how these energies affect each other, what we see is that Mars views Saturn's energy. So when Saturn is influencing Mars, either by the Mars being in one of Saturn's Rashis, aside from the idea of exaltation or debilitation, Mars sees Saturn's energy as a neutral thing. So it's neither energized nor is it hindered just by the influence of being in Saturn's Rashi or by Saturn's aspect. Conjunctions are a different story, and we'll get to that. So now the opposite now with Saturn, or not the opposite, but it's different with Saturn. With Saturn, Saturn views Mars as an enemy. So whenever Saturn is in the Rashi of Mars, aside from just being debilitated there, in either Aries or Scorpio, or being planetary aspected by Mars, Saturn gets hindered by Mars' aspect because Saturn views Mars' influence to Saturn as inimical. And so there's a certain hindrance of what Mars wants to, what Mars' agenda is, disrupts Saturn's agenda, basically. And again, we'll get into conjunctions in the latter part of this video. So right now, we're looking at the singular affectation of one planet to the other. So Saturn does nothing to either hinder or hurt Mars just by its aspect and just by Mars being placed in Saturn's Rashi. And then Saturn, on the other hand, is hindered, is negatively affected by either Mars's planetary aspect or by being in a sign of Mars. So now what does that look like? So first off, we talked about the exaltation place of Mars. which we know is Capricorn, Saturn's Rashi. But then by being an Aquarius, Mars is neither, like I said, neither hurt or hindered. So there's nothing that Saturn really does. So what does Saturn want to do? Saturn wants us to slow down and take time to focus and to do the hard work, you know, and to just take one thing to the next. And Mars, on the other hand, Mars is about Mars is the planet of logic. And logic is about doing the next step in the equation. Whatever makes sense to take the next necessary action, Mars is very singularly focused. And so that's why Saturn's influence to Mars isn't necessarily a hindrance if Mars is just in Saturn's sign or Mars is being planetary aspected by Saturn. Mars isn't necessarily hurt because Mars already has that. Mars is already in its capacity. It's like, this is the next thing to do, and and there's only one way to do it, and it's very opinionated. And by Saturn being, you know, slow moving and also focused on it and wanting to stay there and do the hard work, it does nothing necessarily to hinder Mars. It does nothing to help Mars necessarily either, though. Saturn, on the other hand, is a cruel planet. So his aspect, not necessarily being in his sign, but his aspect is going to always carry the weight of a Saturn aspect, a heavy aspect. So, and Saturn also represents lameness. Saturn represents difficulties. Saturn represents struggles. So perhaps Saturn's planetary aspect to Mars, where it's not going to stop Mars from going along its logical process, it might incur more difficulties. It might make this person feel like the next difficult thing that they're achieving is just that much harder. It weighs just that much more on them. And then maybe even they feel like at times they're unable to get things done. But actually I wouldn't say necessarily unable to get things done. We'll talk about that when we get into conjunctions. I would say the planetary aspects, since we're looking at, it's just a cruel planet, but it's a friendship. It just brings more difficult things. It's not just like, so Jupiter aspecting Mars, being a gentle planet and being a friend to Mars is going to support Mars by bringing about more gentle things. You know, make things easier. It's going to ease the path of Mars when he uses its energy. Saturn is going to create more difficult things, but it's not going to stop Mars from achieving its end. But there is times, I'm sure, with Saturn planetary aspecting Mars that the person may be like, is this the right thing to do? I don't know if I can do this. But I don't think it's going to be an overbearing influence. Now let's flip the script here and let's look at Saturn. So we already kind of discussed what Saturn's all about. So when it comes to the activities of what Saturn wants to provide in our lifetimes, what Saturn wants us to be doing is the hard work, right? It's about the mundane stuff in our life, and it's about just plodding through what we have to go through in life, not trying to get away from it, but just staying focused on that one task for the longest amount of time as possible, weathering the storm, being able to make it, letting go of the things that aren't working in our lives, and being able to just continue and survive and go forward. But Saturn wants to take the slow pace. Saturn wants to just sit there and deal with the problem, be there with the problem, and make it through. Mars, on the other hand, says, there's a problem here. I either need to fix it or I need to get out of here. You know, whatever is the most logical situation. What that does, when Mars is aspecting Saturn, or Saturn's in the sign of Mars, Saturn struggles. The individual, the person that has this in their chart, struggles at times to, because they feel like they need to get out of it. This is where people have problems with where they put their energy to. And what I mean by that is Mars is all about our energy and applying our will, applying where we want to go and how we're going to go about things in an immediate sense. And Saturn is about hanging in there and just sticking with it. So there's this frustration that starts building with Mars aspecting Saturn of they feel like things need to be moving faster. They need to be getting more things done than they are. And they don't even know if they're able to do all these things because they can't sit there with the bad things. It's not as easy to sit there with the bad things. They want to move on to the next, or they want to fix the problem that can't be fixed right away, which is what Saturn's all about. Dealing with, for example, let's say you have a car that's an older car, and maybe it needs to, and maybe it runs okay, but there's some problems with the engine, but it runs and it works, so that's Saturn. Saturn's going to say, hey, let's just stick with it. Let's leave this alone. It's perfectly fine the way it is. It has value. It gets me from here to here. It's a little bit run down. It's beat up. Whereas Mars is going to be like, I want to fix this thing. This isn't right. Mars affecting this Saturn. Then the individual starts experiencing this. Gosh, this car is just not fast enough, man. This car is not as good as I want it to be. I want to fix it. I wish I just had time to fix this car. I wish, I could go and get another car, but I have to deal with this. So it becomes this situation of frustration of not being able to just appreciate what it is, that they have a car, but they want their situation isn't as good for them. They want it to be different. And that's where, because Saturn basically becomes agitated by Mars. Because instead of just being able to appreciate the simple and small comforts of life, of just, this is what this car is. It doesn't make sense for me to fix it because it's old. It's not going to be a good investment. And besides, it does what I need it to do. The simple thing gets me from point A to point B. That's all I need. And that's all I need to use it for. Whereas Mars is like, yeah, but I wish it wasn't this slow. I wish this engine was faster. I wish, there's always something going wrong. And that also, what this can do is Mars can make the person always try to make that car faster, or Mars can make the person invest too much of their energy into trying to fix something that's perfectly fine and running and not in the greatest shape, but it doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be used for what it is. That's just an example. I'm just using the car example as an example, and because that's what came to mind right now, so that's what I'm going to do. I like it. Now, let's talk about Mars and Saturn conjunctions. See, this is a little bit different of a story because any planet that is conjunct Saturn, doesn't matter if it's Venus, who's a friend to Saturn, or Mercury, who Saturn sees as a friend, and especially, let's ignore Mercury, let's look at Venus, because Venus and Saturn are mutual friends. Even if Venus has Saturn conjunct it, Saturn at some point is going to be a negative influence to that Venus. Saturn's a negative influence to any planet that he is conjunct, because that's when Saturn really starts bringing his I can't, I'm incapable, I don't quite work type energy. Or things keep getting in the way. And so with Mars, now this is where Mars gets afflicted by Saturn. Mars is afflicted by Saturn only when they're in the same Rashi together. So what's a Mars affliction look like? Well, a Mars affliction by Saturn, it's a very impatient energy. It's an energy of like, I really want to go and do these things, but I just don't know if I can. I don't know if they're worth the time. It's like impatience because of indolence. So in other words, it's like, gosh, I wish I weren't so lazy. It's like, I don't feel like spending my energy right now. And at this end of that, there might be a feeling like, well, I just don't even know if it's going to work out. Because Mars is the planet of just barging head forward and doing something. Mars can be very impulsive. That's why if you get Mars and Rahu together, that's a real sign of just impulsiveness. But Mars with Saturn is the energy just doesn't quite flow. They don't just go head first when they need to. Because that's what Mars is, the planet of emergencies, of quick fixes, of taking care of things immediately. So by being with Saturn, there can be some hesitation towards that. There could be some difficulty, because what can happen is Mars, when he's with Saturn, Saturn's going to be this heavy weight. So it's going to feel like every time I go to use my Mars, there's so much more I feel I have to do, and it's never ending. It's always something else. It's like, yeah, I want to go mow my lawn right now, but gosh, I have to use this lawnmower that's not working, and it always takes so much time, man. I'm just going to sit here. I'll do it later. It could be a sign of procrastination because of that, because it's that idea of, gosh, that's a lot of work. It's like, it can make Saturn conjuncting Mars can really make Mars feel like that's just so much work that I have to do. Now, and then that's where the frustration, it's real sign. If you see someone with Saturn and Mars together, you can know right away that somewhere in their life, depending on where the house is, what area of life is being affected there, by that conjunction, there can be some impatience. There can be some procrastination. There can be some feelings of incapability, of some kind of low capacity. Like I can't, every time I try and exert my influence there, it's just more trouble than it's worth, Now, when Saturn is, by Mars being conjunct Saturn, it's going to be basically the same thing, just a little bit more extreme to what I already talked about with Saturn being in one of Mars signs. It's going to be this idea of like, I'm not, of being rushed all the time, of being hurried, of, always wanting to fix things and maybe putting energy in the wrong place. And so it's just a little bit more heightened. So with this conjunction altogether, this is a conjunction of impatience, but this can also be, there's always, whenever you see planets also, one thing to always consider is that sometimes we build these kind of like egoic scaffolding on top of this. It's sort of like we are trying to like compensate for this energy, So I mean, with Saturn afflicting Mars like that by being conjunct Mars, what that can do is make one question one's will. This can be something where someone doesn't feel like they're good enough. They have a feeling of like, man, I never can use my energy. It's never good enough. But so there's one way where that can make someone really kind of like unwilling to use their energy. On the other hand, it can have the exact kind of opposite effect, that kind of energy of compensation, where what that does is a person will they'll have like a fear of failure. And so it's that fear of failure that will drive them forward. Mars and Saturn can make someone a success because they don't ever want to be wrong. So they want to prove how smart they are. They want to go out and prove how good they are because they have this feeling deep inside that, I don't want to make mistakes. I don't want to be looked at as a failure. They might have like this sort of belief system that mistakes equal failure. And so they'll build like this edifice complex on top of that where they're like, I'm just going to keep going. So, and whenever you get two cruel planets together, another thing, this is the positive aspect now. Let's just go ahead and turn the page. Let's talk about the positive influence now of Mars and Saturn together. What can Mars and Saturn do? Mars and Saturn together can make a person very hardworking, especially if this conjunction is in the 3rd, the 6th, or the 11th house. Very important because those are kind of our houses of action, activity, and what we're trying to achieve in our lives. So having Saturn and Mars there is going to make a person work harder because both Saturn and Mars are the planets of survival. And so the planets of survival know what needs to be done and what needs to be done now. And they're not afraid to do the hard work. So for example, the sixth house, the house of delays, debts, obstacles. It's also the house of servants and employees, and it's a house. So what does that all mean? It's a house of work. It's a house of us having to put energy into things. So whereas in that sixth house you have Saturn and Mars on the first hand, you know, if you want to look at Mars afflicting Saturn and Saturn afflicting Mars, you could say that, yeah, this person, when they go about their work, you know, they kind of have this attitude of struggle, or, you know, of being able to do the right thing, and maybe but they're also going to have a very hard working ability, because you don't want that necessarily in an angle or a trine, because those are the houses of ease. When houses of ease have Mars and Saturn in them, so which would be the first, the fifth, or the ninth, or houses of someone's activity, the first, the fourth, the seventh, and the 10th, which are the angles, then those are the houses where you want gentle planets typically, because you want, you know, there to be ease with your effort, ease with your grace, you know. Like the first, fifth, and ninth are us receiving grace, basically, especially the fifth and the ninth. And having Saturn and Mars in one of those houses is like effort and grace. It's like, I have to work hard at that. I can't just accept things to come easily in my life. I have to work hard for them. Everything they get, you know, every grace, they're going to see grace as hard work, which is not exactly the easiest belief system to have. Whereas having it in the third, sixth, 11th is like, when I go to apply myself and when I go to practice my skills, to hone my craft, I'm really going to just get dirty. I'm going to dive head first. I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to do, and I'll be willing to do anything. And these are, so Saturn in the third, 6th, 11th can be people that can really help to build their skills up. Can be very skilled people because they're not afraid to put in the time. In fact, they might not be afraid, or they might be compensating for some feeling of inability, which gives them the effort, extra oomph to make that difficult house work. So anyhow, and then that's one way to look at it real quick. When you have the conjunctions, you can look at what house it's coming in, but then you always want to look at what houses are ruled by Mars and Saturn. Especially when Mars is affecting Saturn, you always want to think about, well, what does Mars rule in this chart? The things that Mars rules, aside from Mars's natural karkaship, is going to be what is working against Saturn not being able to function as well. And then the same thing, if you have Saturn and Mars conjunction, then it's the houses that Saturn rules, those two consecutive houses that Saturn rules, will be the things that are holding up Mars, that are going to be delaying Mars. That's just an extra bit of detail that you can use to craft it. But anyhow, so basically to summarize everything, when it comes to Saturn and Mars, the two planets of survival, when we have the conjunctions of these planets, we get into this idea of it could be a fear of failure, but that fear of failure can drive them to do more success because they're doing more hard work. They're willing to put in the energy. But it can also be frustrating because they might want that energy to be working in a way that it's currently not. And they might be wanting that energy to work in a way that it just never will work. But they'll keep going. They'll keep trying to fix the old car that still has more problems. And then we'll always keep breaking down. So instead of, maybe if they don't see this, but maybe with that old car, they should fix the carburetor first. And if they fix the carburetor, the fuel's running to it, it's working better, but they just keep focusing on putting more horsepower into the car, but doing nothing about, making sure that it gets more gas efficiently. It's things like that where they can keep doing the same thing wrong. Every time they put their energy out there, they put their energy into something that's going to take them more time. But it can also, they'll be more focused to do it. They'll stay at that project for a longer time as well. So anyhow, if you've made it this far, I thank you, and please do all your little YouTube things, subscribe, share, comment, add to the discussion, and other than that, I would just like to say thank you for watching, and namaste.